Have you ever wondered why world history as taught in schools becomes surprisingly clear and detailed only from the beginning of the 19th century? We are taught to believe in a linear development of humanity, where progress smoothly flowed from wooden splinters to electricity and from creaking carts to powerful steam locomotives. Yet the moment you pick up a calculator and compare official demographic data, this neat picture instantly falls apart. We have been misled for centuries, and the greatest lie is hidden not in the distant ancient past, buried by the sands of time, but right under our noses, at the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries. Let us ask a simple but extremely uncomfortable question. Why was it precisely at the beginning of the 19th century that almost all world powers, as if on command from a single invisible center, rushed to conduct total population censuses? Official science mutters something vague about a sudden need to collect taxes and recruit soldiers. We are told that kings and emperors suddenly, all at once, became concerned with dry statistics. But let us look at the facts soberly and analytically. The year 1801. France, Great Britain, and the United States of America almost simultaneously begin the first nationwide censuses in their history. In Russia, at the same time, so-called revisions are carried out, becoming more rigid and thorough with each passing year. Can we really believe in such coincidences? In a world where, according to official textbooks, there was no internet, no instant communication, no single coordination center, rulers of completely different countries suddenly decide at the same time to count their subjects. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say, the survivors? This synchrony looks disturbingly unnatural. It resembles not an administrative reform, but an emergency inventory of what remains. As if someone powerful gave the order to record the state of human resources after some global event about which historians prefer to maintain a deathly silence. Before this moment, chronology is often blurred, full of gaps and myths. But after the census, history becomes suspiciously precise, as if someone began writing it from a clean slate. Before we reveal what exactly the emperors and presidents of that era were so carefully trying to hide, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. This helps us dig out the truth that will never be written in school textbooks. If we discard the version of banal bureaucracy, a completely different picture opens up. To understand the true meaning of what was happening, we need to reconsider the role of the key figures of that time. Look at Napoleon Bonaparte from a different angle. Cast aside the familiar romantic aura of the great commander and conqueror imposed by literature. Look at his actions as the work of a hard-nosed crisis manager, or, if you like, the chief auditor of Europe. His gigantic army, this colossal machine, moved across the continent. But what was its true purpose? Was it the seizure of territory for the sake of glory, or a large-scale inventory of what remained on the ruins of the old world? The answer to this question turns all our ideas about the past upside down. Look at Napoleon Bonaparte and his massive campaigns from a completely different perspective, discarding the usual school clichés about a thirst for world domination. What if these endless marches across Europe and deep into Russia were not conquest operations in the usual sense, but something else entirely? Imagine the actions of the French emperor as the work of a high-level crisis administrator, and his army as a gigantic staff of auditors and inspectors, whose main task was a global inventory of assets. In this version of history, the goal was not the seizure of territory to expand borders, but the documentation of what had survived on the continent after some catastrophic event that official sources prefer not to mention. Oddities begin to appear as soon as we try to analyze the logistics of the Napoleonic Wars from the standpoint of common sense and the laws of physics. We are told about armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, which, together with horses, heavy artillery, and endless supply trains, rapidly moved across enormous distances. However, any logistics specialist will tell you that the state of road infrastructure at the beginning of the 19th century, according to the same official data, simply did not allow for such maneuvers. Dirt roads washed out by rain would not have withstood the passage of such masses of people and equipment. Cannons weighing several tons would inevitably have sunk into the mud within a few dozen kilometers. But the army moved, and moved suspiciously fast. Where were they going? They were heading towards cities that, in engravings of the time, look majestic yet strangely deserted. Recall the famous March on Moscow in 1812. The official historical version states that the Russian commander Kutuzov made the difficult decision to abandon the city in order to preserve the army, and Napoleon entered the empty capital unopposed. But why was it empty? We are told that the residents, showing patriotism, left their homes. Think about the numbers. More than 200,000 people, all at once, on foot, with belongings, with the elderly and small children, leaving for nowhere in particular. Anyone even slightly familiar with evacuation logistics will confirm that such a movement of enormous masses of people under the conditions of that time is a logistical nightmare impossible to carry out without immense chaos and colossal losses. But what if we look at the situation differently? What if the city had been empty long before the arrival of both Russian and French troops? Perhaps Kutuzov was not abandoning a thriving capital, but simply retreating from a ghost city that made no sense to defend. In that case, Napoleon was not marching to capture the heart of an enemy empire, but to record the condition of surviving property in an already dead megapolis. He entered a city where silence reigned in the grand halls, and warehouses were full, yet there was no one to guard them. This explains why the French felt so uneasy there, and why the city eventually went up in flames. Perhaps as a way to hide traces of what was found there, or as the result of a final cleansing of the territory. Here we come face to face with the main contradiction of the 19th century, one that is obvious to any attentive researcher. It is a mismatch of scale. We see vast avenues seemingly designed for streams of transport that had not yet been invented, gigantic squares capable of holding millions, and majestic buildings with enormous doorways and high ceilings. All of this was built on an imperial scale, рассчитанном either for giants or for an enormous number of inhabitants. Yet documents and chronicles of the time show us only sparse clusters of people who look alien in these settings. It is like ants trying to inhabit an abandoned human house. Grand architecture and empty streets create an unsettling sense that the current inhabitants of these cities are not their creators, but merely случайные passers-by who took vacant space. It is precisely here that we come right up against the main contradiction of the 19th century, which upon close examination turns into the insoluble paradox of Thomas Malthus. At that very time, at the turn of the centuries, this English scholar publishes his famous theory that the population of the planet grows geometrically, while resources increase only arithmetically. Malthus literally shouted about overpopulation, frightening his contemporaries with inevitable famine and lack of space. But if we move away from the dry lines of his treatises and look at the objective reality of the time, captured in architecture and urban planning, a completely different and frightening picture emerges. Cities described as overcrowded anthills were, in fact, half empty. Picture the master plans of the capitals of that era. The widest avenues, designed on such a scale as if they were meant for streams of automobiles that had not yet even been invented. Gigantic squares capable of accommodating hundreds of thousands of people. Huge doorways several human heights tall, ceilings soaring into infinity. All of this was built with imperial grandeur, intended for giants or for a colossal number of inhabitants with a high culture of everyday life. Yet chronicles and eyewitness accounts of those years paint a depressing contrast. Against the backdrop of these cyclopean ruins and majestic buildings, we see only small groups of people whose condition can hardly be called prosperous. Ragged and confused, they huddle in these palaces, using them for purposes entirely alien to their design. They turn marble halls into stables, light fires on parquet floors, and live among stucco decorations they clearly could not have created with their own hands. Would the builders of such perfect architectural forms treat their creations so barbarically? Obviously not. The barbarians were those who came to everything ready-made. Those whom officials and royal scribes were counting. These people were not creators, but only temporary occupants who took someone else's place. So why did Malthus need to invent the myth of overpopulation in a world that looked half extinct? The answer is simple, and therefore even more terrifying. The theory of overpopulation was an information smokescreen designed to hide a catastrophic decline in humanity's numbers. The authorities needed to explain why cities stood half-empty and infrastructure decayed without proper maintenance. They turned the situation upside down. Instead of admitting that civilization was on the brink of extinction, they cynically declared that there were too many of us. This is a classic method of mass consciousness manipulation. Blame the victim for something that does not exist in order to conceal what is really happening. This grand deception was necessary to manage chaos. Acknowledging the fact of global depopulation would have caused panic and the final collapse of governance. The theory of overpopulation, however, created the illusion of control and competition. But if cities stood empty, who eventually occupied these majestic ruins? Where did the new inhabitants come from? People who did not remember their kinship and did not know how to handle the complex mechanisms of the past. Here we approach the solution to one of the darkest mysteries of literature and history, encoded in the concept of dead souls, and to the real process of populating empty houses, a process that happened very differently from what we were told in literature classes. Imagine a simple but chilling situation. You enter a huge, richly furnished mansion. Fine porcelain tableware still stands on the tables. The tea in the cups seems not yet cold. Solid clothes tailored to the owners hang in the wardrobes, and embers glow in the fireplaces. But the house is filled with ringing silence. The owners are gone. They vanished, dissolved into thin air, leaving all their property behind. You are a random wanderer who has stumbled upon this wealth. You occupy the house, and the first thing you do to secure your claim is conduct an inventory. You list chairs, silverware, paintings in heavy frames, and of course, you list the few people who accidentally survived and now hide in basements or attics, frightened and disoriented. This is essentially what the monarchs of Europe and the presidents of America were doing at the beginning of the 19th century. We are a civilization of squatters. We occupied someone else's house without asking permission and simply replaced the nameplates on the doors. The entire 19th century was not an era of great discoveries and construction, but a period of global self-seizure and legalization of inheritance rights to the legacy of a vanished, highly developed civilization. The population census was not just statistical accounting. It was a legal procedure for registering ownership of living and non-living inventory. In Russia, this process bore a very telling name: revision tales. The very phrase sounds like open mockery by bureaucracy of reality itself. Not reports, not registers, but tales. Nikolai Gogol did not choose the theme of dead souls as the central plot of his immortal work by accident. Writers of that era often worked as insiders, encoding forbidden truth in artistic images. Chichikov buys dead peasants who are listed as alive in documents. Officially, it is for a financial scam. But if we dig deeper, it is a perfect illustration of the demographic chaos of that time. The lists were fiction, created to give the appearance of population in vast, empty territories. The authorities needed to fill the void on paper while real people were absent. Look at geographical maps. Vast expanses of Eurasia and North America on maps of the 17th and 18th centuries are dotted with city names. Great Tartaria, Grustina, numerous settlements in Siberia and the Far East. The density of cities there is comparable to modern Europe. But on maps of the mid-19th century, these same places suddenly turn into giant blank spots or deserts. Where did hundreds of cities disappear? Where did the millions of people who inhabited them and maintained the infrastructure go? The 19th century census was an operation to legalize new settlers on old ruins. To secure success, strict control was required. That is why Napoleon introduced the passport system and so-called workbooks. Before this, people moved around the world relatively freely. Borders were uslovny. But the new power imposed a rigid attachment of a person to paper. Without documents, a worker could not get a job at a factory, could not move to another city, could not buy food. He became an outcast. It was the first paper dictatorship in history. The authorities needed to stop the chaotic Brownian movement of survivors wandering across empty lands in search of sustenance. They needed to bind new slaves to specific surviving factories and cities, forcing them to service infrastructure they had not built. You were counted, given a number, and assigned a place of residence. Anyone without documents automatically became a criminal. Thus was created the system of total control in which we still live today. But for the new inhabitants who occupied someone else's palaces and used them as communal housing not to ask unnecessary questions about who built these arches and where this incredible masonry came from, something had to be done about their memory. And most importantly, the problem of those who remembered the truth and refused to accept the new imposed reality had to be solved. A special fate awaited them, hidden behind a facade of humanism and concern for mental health. We encounter a phenomenon that official historians prefer to call a manifestation of suddenly awakened 19th century humanism, but which, upon detailed and impartial examination, looks like the creation of a gigantic, well-organized prison system. We're talking about the mass, even explosive construction of psychiatric institutions around the world. Starting in the 1840s, in the United States of America and Europe, so-called Kirkbride Plan buildings begin to spring up like mushrooms after rain. These are not just hospitals or medical aid points. They are colossal Gothic castles of red brick and cut stone that, in their scale, quality of masonry, and architectural grandeur, surpass many royal residences and government buildings of the time. State hospitals like those that appeared in Danvers or Buffalo are true architectural masterpieces, with towers, spires, complex ventilation systems, and vast surrounding parklands. We are expected to believe that the state suddenly decided to spend astronomical budgets on the comfortable care of the mentally ill. Does that sound plausible? We are talking about an era when, according to the same official version of history, child labor was the norm, social insurance did not exist as a concept, and factory workers died of exhaustion and injuries by the age of 30. In a world where the life of an ordinary healthy person was worth pennies, governments built real palaces for the insane. Here lies the terrible secret of the census and population revisions. The census process identified not only those who physically survived, but also those who were mentally intact and ready to accept the new rules of the game. After a global catastrophe, the nature of which is still not entirely clear to us, survivors were in a state of severe post-traumatic stress. Many simply lost their minds from the horror they had witnessed, or from exposure to unknown weapons that altered the climate. These giant complexes we now call mental hospitals were originally designed either as sanatoriums for rehabilitating the elite of the old world, or more likely, as high-security isolation facilities for those who remembered too much. Those who refused to accept the new reality and believe in the freshly written history were declared insane and locked away in these castles forever. The statistics of those years are frightening in their dynamics. The number of officially registered insane people in the mid-19th century grows geometrically. This was not an epidemic of brain diseases. It was a large-scale purge of witnesses. Anyone who began to talk about what the world looked like before the catastrophe, about technologies of free electricity or a different planetary geography, received a diagnosis and a one-way ticket. By isolating adults capable of passing on knowledge and truth about the past, the system faced a serious economic problem, a shortage of obedient labor. The old cadres were either destroyed, locked up, or broken. Where could new people be obtained? Blank slates ready to work for food. The answer lies in another frightening phenomenon of that era, the emergence of gigantic foundling homes. In conditions of famine, cold, and total devastation following the climatic anomalies of the early 19th century, the planet's population should have been declining. Instead, we observe the strangest demographic paradox in human history. Contrary to the laws of biology and common sense, the number of people not only stabilizes, but begins to grow rapidly. And this growth occurs not through natural birth rates in strong families capable of feeding their offspring, but through the appearance of enormous masses of children who effectively had no parents. We enter the territory of one of the darkest and most closely guarded secrets of that century, the secret of foundling homes. Forget the touching images of lonely orphans from Dickens novels. We are talking about processes on an industrial scale. In Moscow, St. Petersburg, London, and Paris, cyclopean complexes officially called shelters are built almost simultaneously. The Imperial Foundling Home in Moscow is a building comparable in area and volume to the Kremlin. It is a real city within a city. Do you really believe that a state indifferent to the life of an adult taxpayer suddenly decided to build palaces for abandoned infants? The statistics of those years horrify any researcher. In some years, up to half of all newborns in major cities ended up within the walls of these institutions. Where did they come from in such numbers? The official version claims that peasants and the urban poor massively abandoned their children due to unbearable poverty. But archival documents reveal a strange pattern. These children had not only no surnames, but no genetic memory of the past at all. They were educated from scratch according to unified, rigid standards, creating ideal soldiers, workers, and servants for the new system. These were the very Ivans who remember no kin, spoken of in folk memory. There is a theory, supported by indirect evidence of deliveries of special medical and technical equipment to these closed institutions, that they were not shelters in the traditional sense at all. They were distribution centers of genetic material, or, if you will, incubators that were depreserved and launched at full capacity after the catastrophe. The authorities were not just counting people during censuses, they were conducting large-scale selection. They needed new people, blank slates who did not know what free energy was, who had never seen the previous world order, and who were ready to work for food and an idea. These foundling children, raised in barracks-like conditions, became the biological foundation of 19th century nations. We are all, to one degree or another, descendants of these rootless people. That is why, in most family trees, it is so difficult, and sometimes impossible, to find reliable information about ancestors deeper than the mid-19th century. There, in the depths of time, we encounter a black hole, an informational vacuum behind which an incubator hides. These new people were given new surnames, invented a new, safe history for them, and handed primitive technologies, presenting them as the pinnacle of progress. But for this deception to work perfectly, it was necessary to physically destroy traces of the old world's greatness that could provoke unwanted questions in the new generation. And the main tools of this purge were not so much wars as fire and grand public spectacles. If the previous stage was the preparation of a loyal population, then the events of the mid and second half of the 19th century can safely be called a total formatting of the planet's hard drive. The authorities were not just counting survivors and raising new ones. They were methodically destroying material traces of what the world looked like before the catastrophe. The main tools of this massive cleansing were not so much military actions as fire and bureaucracy. Have you ever thought about the strange, frightening epidemic of great fires that swept the civilized world in the 19th century? It looks like a statistical anomaly that defies explanation by chance. Cities that had stood for hundreds of years suddenly begin to burn to the ground with terrifying synchrony. The Great Fire of New York, fires in Hamburg, Pittsburgh, Chicago, Boston. Official history blames wooden construction, kerosene lamps, or a cow kicking over a bucket. But if you study reports and testimonies, a different picture emerges. The fire destroyed neighborhoods built of stone and brick. Temperatures were so high that granite melted and metal turned into pools, something impossible in an ordinary household fire. But the most interesting part is what burned first. With surgical precision, the fire destroyed city archives, land registries, property records, and patent offices. In 1836, the U.S. Patent Office burned down, destroying thousands of documents about past technologies. This was the deliberate deletion of civilization's source code so new elites could appropriate infrastructure and knowledge, nullifying the rights of old owners. In parallel with the destruction of memory by fire, there was a substitution of meanings through achievements. World's fairs of the 19th century were not progress expos, as we are told. They were population programming centers. The famous Crystal Palaces in London, New York, and Munich were gigantic structures of glass and metal, allegedly built in a matter of months and then dismantled or, accidentally, burned down. There is a well-founded version that these objects were not built for the exhibitions. They were excavated, restored, or simply washed. They were greenhouses or climate domes of a past civilization. People were shown these wonders as fresh inventions, implanted with the correct picture of the world, and then the originals were destroyed so engineers of the new generation could not study the designs too closely and understand their true purpose. Another diversion on a planetary scale was the quiet revolution in information carriers. Until the mid-19th century, paper was made from rags, linen, and cotton. It could last for thousands of years. But precisely during this period, industry sharply switched to wood pulp using acids. The lifespan of such paper is just over 100 years, after which it crumbles to dust. The authorities deliberately made history disposable. At the same time, gold was withdrawn. The introduction of the gold standard forced people to surrender this metal to banks in exchange for paper. Gold is an ideal conductor, necessary for high-tech devices. It was removed from everyday life and technical circulation by declaring it money, in order to deprive humanity of the ability to recreate atmospheric electricity technologies. We live on ruins, using fragments of a great civilization without even realizing it. Railroads laid in perfect straight lines across mountains and swamps, and giant navigable canals. These are not things we built from scratch, but things we excavated and adapted for our primitive needs. Now let us take a close look at how this rewritten society lived and finally convince ourselves that we exist in an era of a second global revision. The technologies presented to us as great 19th century inventions, upon closer inspection, turn out to be primitive means of survival in post-apocalyptic conditions. Take canned food, for example. We are told that Nicolas Appert invented it for culinary progress. But look at the situation from the logic of catastrophe. If soil is contaminated or buried under layers of clay, if the climate is disrupted, recall the year without a summer, then agriculture is impossible. Preservation became a species-saving technology. Huge food reserves, perhaps found in warehouses of the previous civilization, or produced in emergency mode, had to be distributed among the population. This was dry rations for survivors, and the can became a symbol not of abundance, but of the fact that fresh food simply did not exist. The same applies to infrastructure. We are proud of the Suez Canal, or the Erie Canal in the United States, believing they were dug by peasants with shovels. But the volumes of excavated soil are comparable to the work of modern bucket wheel excavators, and spoil heaps are often simply not there. We did not build these waterways. We dug them out and cleared them. They were ancient technical structures, perhaps parts of a global energy or drainage system, which we adapted for primitive navigation. Railways laid perfectly straight could have served for energy transmission, and we put steam locomotives on them, essentially samovars on wheels. We used the most complex supercomputer of the past to hammer nails and call it an industrial revolution. The very term revolution, so beloved by historians for this period, is translated from Latin as rollback, return, or turnover. This is not forward movement toward the stars. It is the completion of a cycle. The 19th century was a system reboot after collapse. Napoleon, Alexander I, Queen Victoria, all of them were not so much rulers as administrators on ruins. Their task was to inventory surviving property, count remaining biological resources, and implement a new operating system of reality in which we still live. Our history was stretched, dark ages invented, to hide the cyclical nature of processes and make us believe in linear progress. But the most important thing to realize is this: the great census of the 19th century never ended. It continues right now, only the tools have changed. Instead of paper books and quill pens, servers, big data, and artificial intelligence are used. We are being counted again, our resources evaluated, our movements and biometric data tracked. Global inventory has reached a new digital level. The elites are once again preparing the planet for something grand, and perhaps we stand on the threshold of another reset or transition into a new cycle. Those conducting this revision know perfectly well that human memory is short. It is enough to change 3 generations, rewrite textbooks, and alter language for people to believe anything, even that they descended from apes and have always lived in a world of steam engines and kerosene lamps. History is cyclical, and to understand what awaits us tomorrow, we must have the courage to learn what really happened yesterday. We live in scenery whose meaning was never explained to us, but the keys to the solution lie right under our feet. If this information made you think and look differently at familiar things, support our work with a like. Right now, 2 videos have appeared on your screen that will further overturn your understanding of the real past and the technologies stolen from us. Do not miss them. The truth hidden behind textbook pages is far more astonishing than any fiction.